Thank you so much, Terry, for that lovely introduction. I'm used to giving sleep-deprived talks on epilepsy and epilepsy genetics sort of anywhere in the world, but I find this actually quite a daunting task. Today we celebrated Frank's scientific contribution. I think everybody agrees it was a wonderful day, and we're really grateful to our international and national speakers who came. And it's really a daunting privilege as one of Frank's students now to talk about Frank the person and his humanitarian work. We're all shaped by history and experiences, and sometimes these sublimate in actions in quite remarkable ways. Frank was born in Budapest, Hungary 80 years ago, 14th of October 1935. A terrible time for European Jewry, with worse to come. In 1938, the first anti-Jewish laws were passed in Hungary, and the screw gradually began to turn. The atrocities gradually increased, and in mid-1944, under the terrible regime of Adolf Eichmann, 400,000 Hungarian Jews were deported, including Frank's father. He was deported to Auschwitz, and sadly that's where Frank and my story somewhat intersect. My father was also there and thankfully survived, but many of his family died, and Frank's father was also murdered. Frank lived in a protected house, the Alice Weiss Hospital in Budapest. As we've heard today, he was taken to be executed with 20 women from the hospital to the barracks in October 1944 by the Arakroth, the Hungarian version of the SS, and that was for the crime of removing the yellow star. He was lined up in front of a machine gun, and he was saved and returned to the safe house as a person under neutral protection by the Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg, who with his colleague Per Unger did amazing things by issuing protective passports, or so-called schutzpasses, which identified the bearers as Swedish subjects. Really not strictly legal documents, but they worked, and Wallenberg was an amazing and courageous person. And he saved tens of thousands of people. He rented buildings in Budapest and called them the Swedish this and the Swedish that, and saved an enormous number of people that way. Frank was forced to line up for selection in January of 1945. He hid in his wardrobe while members of his family were taken by the fascists and murdered by being shot into the River Danube. Many of you have visited that wonderful city of Budapest, a beautiful European city, and many of you will have seen the stirring and disturbing memorial of shoes lined up by the water. And that's the memorial to people that were shot in the Danube in very large numbers. The surviving members sought out Raoul Wallenberg, but he was unable to intervene, and he disappeared on the 17th of January 1945, shortly before the liberation of Budapest. The fate of Wallenberg is uncertain. Frank may tell us a little more about that later. It was initially said by the Soviets that he died in 1947, and it's pretty clear that was untrue. And it seems he was probably alive in the 1980s. 35 members of Frank's family were murdered in the Holocaust, He remained in Hungary. He began his high school education there in the period 1946 to 1949, and he escaped from Hungary in August of 1949, briefly via Austria, and he came to Australia in 1951, where he completed his education at Melbourne High School, went on to study medicine at the University of Melbourne, and you've heard more about that earlier. I first met Frank as a medical student at the Austin around 1976. I was a fifth year student. He was an active clinical academic, a patient and devoted teacher, and I fondly remember our tutorial groups within his very messy office on level 5 of the Townsend building at the Austin. Medicine, research and teaching seemed to be the things that drove this cultured and highly intelligent European bloke, and he was inspiring to be with. Our shared Jewish heritage was an extra bond, but really the business at hand was medicine and later neurology. Although Frank was always a product of this and his history, and he clearly had an intense interest in the Holocaust, in about 1982 he became aware of the intricacies of the disappearance of Wallenberg, who had personally saved him, and his likely imprisonment in the USSR. And I understand that happened after a BBC film. And this transformed Frank and drove him into action. I was training in neurology at that time in the early 80s, beginning my MD, which Frank co-supervised with wise and reasoned judgment, and I'm always grateful to him for guiding me through those early parts of my research career. And I must say, I was puzzled by his seeming obsession with Wallenberg. I have the so-called second generation Holocaust syndrome, where one is protected by one's parents from discussing it, and one didn't overtly acknowledge that this kind of shaped one's life, and it kind of wasn't part of it. And I remember now, to my shame, and it was to my shame, of wondering why Frank was so obsessed by this. And I remember this troubling me at the time, but with some passing years it's become clear why. Frank founded and chaired the Raoul Wallenberg Committee from 1982. He had Sir Zelman Cowen, for our international guest, a very prominent Jewish Australian who became Governor General. And he had many prominent Australians, including ex-Prime Ministers and the then Chancellor of the University, Sir Douglas Wright, as sponsors. And since then, he's worked tirelessly for the Wallenberg cause, and it's impossible to list all the work that he's done. He's gone every year or so to Sweden. He's testified in the US Congress Human Rights Committee in Washington. He was invited speaker on Swedish television at Wallenberg's 75th birthday celebration in '87. As has already been mentioned, he established the Wallenberg Gardens in Kew and had a statue commissioned, which is there. He's lectured at universities, at schools, at civic functions in Australia, in Sweden, in the US and elsewhere. He translated 2 books on Wallenberg. And one of them was the preface was written by Simon Wiesenthal, the famed Nazi hunter. He's written hundreds of articles and petitions, and as we've heard, he established the Australian Centre for Clinical Neuropharmacology at St Vincent's, which was named the Raoul Wallenberg Centre as a living memorial. He's been widely recognised for his championing of the Wallenberg cause, particularly in Sweden. He was the keynote speaker at the funeral of Per Unger, who was Wallenberg's right-hand man and also a very heroic figure who worked with Wallenberg in Budapest, but thankfully survived. And he was awarded the Royal Swedish Order of the Polar Star, by the King of Sweden in 2003 for his work. Also remarkably, he was invited in 2012 to a Vatican symposium entitled Courage in the Face of Evil, which was the 100th anniversary of Wallenberg's birth. Wallenberg was made an honorary citizen of the US, Canada and Israel, as we heard earlier, and Frank was determined to have Australia bestow this honour as well. This is a particularly un-Aussie thing to do, and a thing that one wouldn't thought was terribly likely. But Frank stuck at it. He had quite a few goes, and in 2013, in a remarkable letter to Senator Bob Carr, then the Foreign Minister, he hit the spot. He garnered wide support from prominent people in academia, in both sides of Parliament, and as Steve remarked in his close, this was really a very moving occasion when Wallenberg was made, in 2013, the first, and I still believe only, honorary citizen of Australia. Frank, we're all the richer for having known you, myself as both a student, a scientific colleague, and for learning about your amazing work in this field. The world needs people like you to bring important issues like Wallenberg to our consciousness, and we all salute you. Happy birthday, Frank, and can we all rise and drink to Frank? To Frank.
Dear friends, I was only going to say a few words and thank people, but there are a number of people in this room who haven't been to any of the earlier sessions, and they've asked me to speak a little longer because they've only come for the reason that I would speak. So I've begged your indulgence and asked permission from Sam, Terry and Mark as the committee organisers, whom I thank, and also each table. And I've been given permission to talk for a bit longer than I expected, but it won't be much longer. But first I would like to say that the only thing that spoils today and this evening is the fact that my dear friend Mervyn Eady isn't here, and that I'm really quite upset by the fact that he wasn't here, but fortunately we have been able to record this professionally thanks to Terry during the day, and by chance, which must be intuitive, I've asked my former scientist Pam Morris if she would have a camera to record Sam's speech, as I didn't expect to speak. And she said yes, she would do that, rang up and ordered her husband, Colonel Morris, to bring about 30 pounds of photographic equipment, 2 cameras, sound, all the machinery required. And you see she's working away on a dinner when she's meant to be an honoured guest, taking photos and making this part of the proceedings also recorded professionally. So thank you very much, Pam, and thank you very much, Colin. I also wish to thank again all the people who have come, and I would like to thank particularly Emilio, Torborn and Karen for coming all that way, but there are other people here from Sweden as well. Michael Long, whom I welcome, he's my contemporary, a famous ex-Melbourne surgeon, and there are many people also from interstate, and if I forget any, it'll haunt me for the rest of my life, and I do forget a few names, but I would like to thank Cecily Lander and Mervyn Lander, who came from Brisbane. I would like to thank Andrew Black and Margie Black, who came from Adelaide. Roy Barron, he was here today, but he's no longer, he's had to go and do something very important like catch a plane. Graham Chappell, who although he says he lives in Brisbane, also lives in Melbourne some of the time, but not always. And I would like to thank people who I have seen for a very long time, including the Greenbergs, old friends and very good friends from 20, 30, 40 years ago, who have honoured me by coming. Leon Kempler, who I haven't seen for a long time. John Salzberg, who is one of our students at the Austin, head of the Peter MacCallum, who came a little later today. And many, many others. Gary McCarthy, who came from Sydney to be here with us. And as I look around, and with my limited vision, I'm able to see John Dunn, who came from Perth, Ernest Somerville, who came from Sydney, and many other people to whom I'm very grateful for coming. And if I've forgotten names, I apologize, but I cannot by name recount everybody because I would never get through the little segment I'm going to say to you. But I've written my autobiography, and Sam did a great job about giving an overview of what I've done in relation to the Wallenberg story and the antecedents of that story. I would still like to give you a little bit more information, a little bit of color, and I hope I'm not going to spoil your evening by telling you this, but my autobiography has been accepted by Monash University Publishing under the name and under the title of Saved to Remember, Budapest, Wallenberg, 1944 and after, and we've signed the contract, and the cover actually showed a bridge across the river Arno instead of the river Danube because of the potential ignorance of the artist at Monash. That's been corrected, and they've put the appropriate blown up bridge across the Danube on the cover. But there is a particular chapter in this which is probably the most dramatic, and I will talk about that. I had 8 close shaves. As you know, after the German occupation of Hungary on the 19th of March 1944, the Hungarian fascists already had in their drawer the plans to deport all of Hungary's 800,000 Jews. And they've managed actually in 6 weeks to deport 436,000 of them, largely to Auschwitz. Budapest, the capital, where approximately 200,000 Jews were hidden or living in tremendous overcrowding, was meant to be the last district. And the Germans were going to use that particular city as the last site for deporting people to Auschwitz. And it so happened that they've started by deporting the outer suburbs. And some of my relatives who lived in the outer suburbs were in fact deported to Auschwitz and never seen again. We lived about 2 kilometers from the outer suburbs. So had we not moved into a protected house at that time, we would have been 2 kilometers away and possibly a week away from being deported and gassed. So we were very lucky, but that was the first close shave. We did not live in the outer suburbs by this time. My grandmother died on April the 21st, 1944. And we were warned not to go to the cemetery for the funeral because the gendarmes and the police were collecting people for deportation, more or less as a trial run. And I remember my mother looking at our relatives, advising us against going to the funeral, said, "Do you think there is any power on this world that will stop me from going to my mother's funeral?" And she said, "I'm going." And I stood up and I said, "I'm going too." And they said, no, the child's not going. But the child went, and we went to the funeral. We arrived to the cemetery. We saw the police. We went in, we had the service, and then there was an air raid. The police scuttled into the shelters. We buried my grandmother, and with great dignity, without any panic or fuss, walked back, caught the tram. The air raid was called off, and went back to the capital. That was the second close shave. Subsequently, we lived in this protected house, a 2-story small maternity hospital, and in the loft, in the attic, my mother was listening to the BBC. And she was one of the few people who spoke good enough English to understand what's going on. And we were monitored by a German radio detector unit who toured the city and tried to pick up people receiving foreign broadcasts or sending messages. And they turned up, the Gestapo, a number of soldiers, an officer. My mother was of course informed that they've come. She hid the radio in the attic and came down. Everyone was assembled and they started asking questions. My mother spoke German perfectly. And when I say perfectly, I speak German, but my mother spoke it perfectly. She started a discussion with the German Gestapo officer saying, "Sir, how can you imagine that we have a machine to send messages to the enemy? We have no military secrets, we have no machines, we haven't been listening." And they ended up in a conversation and the Gestapo pissed off. And we survived, and that was really a very close shave. Subsequently, there was what they call a coup d'etat, and the relatively less violent extreme government was overthrown by a violent extreme bunch of the Arrow Cross. And they decided to murder the Jews on the spot. There was no need for deportation. However, what happened the day before this happened, the regent of Hungary asked for a truce from the Russians and from the West and wanted to surrender Hungary to end the war. So the Arrow Cross took over by force, and because we were reported as having ripped off the Jewish star, because we were so jubilant that the war may be over, they sent out a patrol to check if the people in that protected house, which was a hospital, a Jewish hospital, were in fact guilty of this cardinal major crime of removing the yellow star. And this is probably the most horrible moment in my life. I came in from the back part of this hospital, playing in the garden, and heard my mother on the ground floor in a violent argument with a bunch of 6 highly armed teenage or early 20s terrorists with heavily fortified machine pistols and hand grenades and bayonets and so on, abusing these rotten women for ripping off the star. And my mother said, we did this because His Excellency, the Regent, said that the war was over. So they said, all right, off you go, check your clothes and show us where you have the Jewish star. And I remember going into the room, which was very close to this area where this interrogation began, and try to pin with a safety pin a Jewish star on their jacket, which was ridiculous and in any case was illegal. It had to be firmly affixed. And knowing that if I don't do this in a few minutes, I'll be dead. And we went back, and all these people who didn't have a star properly affixed, they were laughing at us. And they said, line up, we'll take you. And there were about 20 women, and they said, we're not taking the child. But the child went along. So I went along, we marched for about 300 yards to the entrance of their local headquarters, which is a military arsenal. And we were marched through the door, and it was a big building, there was a machine gun set up against the wall, there was a tank on the far right, and it was steaming with soldiers, and we stood there. And then somebody fainted in the group, and I said, what's the matter? He said, they were debating whether to shoot us now or take us to the Danube. And that didn't look good. And, you know, we were wondering, hope of taking us somewhere and maybe we can escape, but if they shoot us now, we're finished. And then Wallenberg arrived, a civilian, with some other civilians. And he entered into conversation with some of the people who took us. A 10-minute chat, no argument, no yelling. We were told to come along, and we were taken back to the protected house. Now, we couldn't believe it. The people who were left behind with they couldn't believe it. I've never heard of people being brought back from execution sites. And it was the most frightful experience which haunts me to this day. So that afternoon, having been taken back, they came, or we thought they came to check to see if the story was true, that we were protected citizens or Swedes. And we couldn't bear being in a situation again. We leaped out of a ground floor window and, removing the Jewish star, walked along those 300 yards again, past the sentries who may have seen us 2 hours earlier, caught the tram and blended into the Aryan population of the city. And after a day of not knowing where to go, we went to a former domestic who was so poor that she rented not a room but a bed in the bedroom of a 1-bedroom flat with the landlord and his wife and their child. And they took us in. The husband wasn't home, but the wife was at home, spoke to the domestic who lived there. She vouched for us. We came from the country, we were bombed out. We went to bed. At 4 a.m, the husband came home, the landlord sat on the edge of the bed. I was pretending to be asleep, and my mother engaged in a conversation with him. We came from the country, we were Christians, we were bombed out. My father was in the army, and he wanted to know which unit, what part of the front, My mother kept inventing numbers and stories and so on, because you had to do that in order to convince him. And eventually he accepted, and we survived there. But the tension was so much, I told my mother the following day, I didn't even try to keep awake because I couldn't have lied as well as she did, and I couldn't have corroborated her story because I really didn't know what she was going to say. So I pretended to be asleep, and when I woke up I said, I didn't know you could lie so well. And then the following day we couldn't bear the tension, we went back to the place where we were originally, in the protected house, knowing that our days are numbered. Meantime, the Arrowcross came back to check on the people they have taken away and made sure that they had documents. And because many had documents, nobody else was taken. But that would have been very difficult had we been there, having brought back and then stayed there and then possibly removed again. So we had about 6 weeks of relative freedom from any atrocities. The siege of Budapest at that time was proceeding, and according to contemporary reports, and I wasn't aware of that, the battle for Budapest, with the bombing, artillery shelling, atrocities in the city, starvation, disease, lack of facilities, was probably one of the most savage, severe street fighting and battle at siege of Budapest, like Stalingrad, second to Stalingrad. And early January they broke in again. They made us line up, bring our documents, and at that point my mother said, we're not risking that again. We'll hide. And I said, where? And she said, behind the bathroom in an airing cupboard where you have your medical coats with holes in them so that they get some air. And normally I would have argued, I would have been a smart ass, but this time I said yes. And we walked out, moved into the cupboard, and that made us survive. A number of my relatives were then taken and murdered in the Danube, and 35 people in all were murdered. Apparently they were denounced that there are military deserters amongst them, so there was an 85-year-old colonel who was taken and he was shot, as well as my teacher who taught us that day, and my aunts. One person came back bruised and beaten, but alive, saying that she jumped into the water before she was shot, and then a German military boat on the Danube gave her a blanket, and she came back and walked back to the place, came back the following day. She told the story, I wasn't allowed to listen, but I glimpsed what was going on, and she's the only survivor. About 30 years later, that story that I've just told you about, this last survivor, appeared on Hungarian television. I've got it in the original and translated into English. On January the 12th, this is about 5 days after this atrocity, resulting in the murder of all those people living with us, suddenly there's enormous noise again. Soldiers broke in, and we jumped up and we thought we were finished, and we looked up and these were different. They wore padded jackets, they had padded hats, and instead of the German Schmeissers and Mausers, they had wooden, rough-handled weapons with air holes. They looked Mongolian, and they were the Russians, and we were liberated. And that probably is one of the greatest joys in my life. And that minute shots rang out, and the SS troops who were housed probably a kilometer away and knew the advance of the Russian front, put a burst of machine guns through the window, and that hit the wall, and that would have hit me if I hadn't been up kissing the Russians. So on the day of liberation, night of liberation, in the minute of liberation, I was nearly wiped out by the fucking SS. But I wasn't, and for that I'm forever grateful. But these are my 8 shaves, close shaves. So I wish to thank everybody for coming. I did speak, if you wanted to hear me speak. This is one of the chapters of my book. Thank you.
And I'll be your MC tonight. I'd like to particularly welcome those friends and colleagues of Frank's that have travelled long distances to join with him in his celebration today. In particular, Torbjörn Thompson from Sweden and his wife Karin, and also Emilio Perucco from Italy. There's also many who have travelled from interstate, and I won't name you all, because there's too many, but thank you very much for making the effort. It's wonderful to have you here, and I know Frank really appreciates it. I also want to particularly also thank Frank's family, Simon and Michelle, for also coming in and sharing this celebration. I know that means a lot to Frank. As I mentioned earlier, Sam, myself and Mark are all one of a long list of Frank's students. And it never ceases to amaze me when we walk through the hospital or other meetings and we run into someone that I haven't met before, usually of eminence, that he says to me, that was one of my students or my residents or my fellows. And this duly attests the profound influence that his extraordinary career has had on medicine in Australia. The teaching and the mentorship, particularly in the areas of neuropharmacology and neurology, is absolutely outstanding. I remember my journey with Frank's supervision started when we had agreed to meet in San Francisco at the American Epilepsy Society meeting. I was at that time doing a fellowship at the Mayo Clinic, and it was 1997, and it was before the days of mobile phones or smartphones, so we had arranged well in advance to meet at this spot at the AES, and I got there early, of course, as a young enthusiastic person wanting to hopefully get a position would do, and I was waiting and I couldn't see someone that looked like Frank Vajda, and eventually I got a tap on the shoulder and turned around and there was Professor Vajda with these two very, very large raccoon eyes, and he had fallen in the bathroom. Was that right, Frank?
Fell over a plastic cord tying carpets together in the street, which wasn't cut. It gripped my ankles and I fell flat on my face and broke the frontal.
That's right. And I knew enough about plastics, I remembered enough about plastics from my medical student career that know that the bilateral raccoon eye sign is not a good thing. But it did make me think that this man is going to be a hell of a guy to work with, and there's nothing's going to stop him, and he won't accept any excuses for not delivering. And sure enough, that was absolutely true, and it was to my absolute benefit. From then on, we have worked together on many different projects, including the pain of going through my MD thesis, and it's been just fantastic. Your mentorship has been so much appreciated. Now, it's also important to acknowledge on this occasion Frank's contributions beyond his medicine, and we heard much about his scientific work this morning. But his second lifelong dedication has been to the memory and legacy of Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish architect, businessman and diplomat and humanitarian who saved his and his mother's life, and that of thousands of other Jews in Nazi-occupied Hungary during the Holocaust of World War II. After Andrei, Sam Berkovic, another one of his MD students, we'll talk more about this and about Sam's life and work, and then propose a toast. Following the main course, we have a couple of surprise talks, and then Frank will have the opportunity and the right of reply. In the meantime, enjoy the entree.
Let me start by saying how privileged I feel by sharing such a day with you. It's been absolutely wonderful and fantastic. So thanks to everyone, and especially to Frank for having me here with you. We heard a lot about what Frank represents for Australian epileptology and the many scholars and disciples that he has in this country. And as you know, he has at least as many all over the world. And I feel privileged to be one of those. And I just like to share a few thoughts about a number of coincidences that happened to my life and touched on Frank's. And maybe they are not fully coincidences. We heard about a triangle of countries from Sam's introduction. We heard about Hungary, we heard Sweden, and we heard Australia. And at a much lower level, there was another country that came into the loop at some point, and that was Italy, where I come from. So just let me start with the first coincidence, and just let me tell you why I went into epileptology. Initially, I actually wanted to do botanics. Then somehow I decided a little bit serendipitously to go into medicine. And when I graduated, I felt I want to be a clinical pharmacologist. So the leading center in clinical pharmacology in Europe at that time was Stockholm. So I went up to the Karolinska Institute in the lab of Professor Sjöqvist. I was just graduated, and I went up on an exchange program just for 2 months. And I took the wrong months, because I took the summer period where all the Swedes are away. So I basically ended up in an empty department, except for the head of the department, who was very supportive, but no one else was there except for a German guy who worked in a very isolated spot in the lab. And so he said, unfortunately, you picked the wrong time. But there is this Dr. Barth, this German fellow, that is working on protein binding of phenytoin, so you might want to go and help him. So to cut the story short, I went to that lab and I started to learn about phenytoin, and they said, okay, not only you want to be a clinical pharmacologist, but you want to work on epilepsy. So I started looking around who was doing clinical pharmacology in epilepsy. And I ended up with Professor Alan Richens. You remember, Frank, very much those days. And the first thing we did, those were pioneering times, were early work in healthy volunteers, pharmacokinetics, where we were the healthy volunteers ourselves. And Alan Richens was a very close friend of Mervyn Eddy at that time. And I remember once when we were testing the hypothesis that the metabolite of phenytoin would inhibit phenytoin metabolism, and that was the cause of the dose-dependent kinetics of phenytoin. So what we basically did is we started injecting ourselves. Ourselves mean Professor Richards himself, myself, and another fellow, with huge amounts of PHPPH after injecting ourselves with radioactive phenytoin, to see what he was doing on the kinetics of the drug. The problem is that the metabolite is very insoluble, so we had to make it up in a very alkaline solution. So I still remember to these days when immediately after an experiment, by the way, I lost all my veins in that experiment because of venous thrombosis, and Alan did the same. And I remember when Alan had to travel to Brisbane, exactly to Brisbane, with an extremely swollen arm out of those experiments. So I gave 3 presentations. My first 3 scientific presentations I remember. The first one was a complete disaster. I am a very emotional person. I'm very shy. I don't like to speak in public, although I'm doing that right now. So the first time I went, I was completely blank. And I never witnessed myself anyone doing so poorly in giving a scientific presentation. Then Alan had to work very hard on me to convince to come up again, and I did rather poorly. So I said, I think I should change job. Or anyway, I can do research, but someone else can present the data. And then I remember I actually worked very hard. Okay, let's go and do a debate. You and I'll help you to do the presentation. And that was in 1978, Frank, and you were there in the audience, and you may remember that debate. And you might remember in that debate, I did not perform so poorly. Actually, my mentor performed worse than me. And I don't think I ever told you, but the reason he performed worse than me was trying to build up my confidence. And so he tried to lose the debate. And I remember you came down, and I knew your name from publications because, I was very much aware of the wonderful things that you have done in science. You came down and you introduced yourself to me. I'm Frank Vajda from Australia. And I could not believe. Frank, are you really Frank? And I have to congratulate you. You did so well in the debate. So that helped a lot in building up my confidence. So this was the first coincidence. French and Sweden, and eventually Frank coming into the loop of my life. And we've been in touch ever since and built up a friendship. And then the second coincidence, and I don't want to spend the entire evening with you telling my life, but the second coincidence happened in 1999, and again, Torbjörn is in the loop as well, because that you remember at those times we were discussing the methodology of the pregnancy registry, the European pregnancy registry, it was at the time, and Frank, you were also building up the Australian registry at the time, and you visited me in Pavia, in my home. I'm actually not living in the city, I'm living in a small village just outside the city, the most North Italian village you can think of, with at the center of the village the square with the church. And our home is very, very small. And we had a problem when Frank and Michelle and Simon visited us, because really we did not have a room for the guests. So again, you may not know that, but we had to struggle to arrange our house. We gave our nice bedroom to them, and we arranged a little room in the back for my wife and I and our son Piero was somewhat to put in the corner there. And they arrived from Australia. You were very tired, I remember that. And then they did not, and we did not factor into the equation a very important thing in Italian life, especially at that time, is that if you have a home just facing the central square in town, in the central square there is a church, and the church has bells. And 10 o'clock in the evening, there would be 10 very strong, reiterated bell sounds. So again, I think it was in the middle of the night, we heard someone knocking at our door. You say, we're very, very tired. We appreciate all your kindness. You gave us your best room. However, we have a problem with the bells. You wouldn't mind switching rooms. You remember that, Frank? And then something important happened at that time. My son Piero, who, by the way, is sitting over there, had just finished high school, and he had to decide what he was going to do when going to university. So that was a very important moment in his life. And I never influenced. I've been always made a point never to influence his choice. So he was entirely free to determine what he wanted to do. But I was a little bit worried, because really I'd come to the conclusion that he wanted to be an archaeologist, which is absolutely fine. But he was a little bit worried about, maybe someday not all many jobs available for being an archaeologist. And during those times that Frank was with us, I noticed that Piero spent very, very long walks with Frank. Completely mysterious to me, because you never told me what you were talking about with Piero, and Piero never told me. But eventually, a couple of weeks after Frank left our home, Piero came to me and said, I think I could do medicine. And then actually it took probably a year later to find out why I had made that decision. And the reason you made that decision, Frank, if I can tell everyone, was the most convincing reason that I'm actually used myself to convince other people to do medicine. Where a young guy, 18 years old, you have no idea of what you're going to be in life. What you said is, if you go into medicine, you can do whatever you want eventually. You want to do research in a lab? Well, you just do your research working with chemistry and little vials. You want to be a lawyer? You can do forensic medicine. You want to be a writer? You can write about the history of medicine and so on. You can be a physician and so on and so forth. So basically he said, if you do medicine later on in life, you can do anything. And eventually ended up being a neurologist and being an epileptologist and ending up in Melbourne, and you play no small role into that as well. So that's many ways you touch my life. Lastly, and this is where Italy comes from, I hear one day someone ringing, the telephone ringing in my office, and it was the reception down at the hospital, and they said, there is an Italian family who would like to meet you, because they say they are friends of someone called Professor Vajda. an Italian family coming and seeing me because they are friends of Professor Vajda. Well, Frank, that was the Verolino family. And that's another important part of that story, because we heard a lot and everyone knows a lot about Raoul Wallenberg. But actually there was someone not as important in Wallenberg, but who played a very important role in helping Jews at those terrible times, and that was a Catholic priest. And for a number of reasons his work was not recognized, but during his research of what was going on at the time, Frank found out about the deeds of this priest and dedicated an enormous, I know Frank, you dedicated an enormous amount of time and work really to make sure that this person would get the right recognition. And if I understand correctly, it took a long time and a lot of work, but you had this guy also in the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, ending up among the just among nations, if I'm not wrong. And when this family came and visited me, they said, you know, Professor Vajda is a hero for the Verolino family, but he's not a hero for the family. He's a hero in our region. He's a hero in our city. We are also proud that you know also Professor Vajda, and that was one of the reasons you also were invited to the Vatican. So, I mean, this man we are here tonight with has been living two incredible parallel lives, and I gave you some examples. He has really changed the lives of so many of us. And all the suffering that you had to go through, Frank, in those times, and I know how much they've been with you and they are with you today, the way you managed to turn that into positive energy is something we all admire and we are grateful for. So thank you very much for all you did for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your kind words, and thank you very much, Frank, and the organizers for having me here and for allowing me to share this wonderful experience. I will only say a few words, but don't relax, I'm Swedish, so we speak slowly. I'm not Italian. I think we met the first time. My history with you is a very short one. We met in 1988, I believe, but it was in Italy, in Milan. So again, there's the link with Italy also. I think it was during an EFNS or an ENS meeting, and Emilio introduced us. And this was at the time when we were thinking of setting up the epilepsy pregnancy registries. And I thought, this is the most British non-Brit I've ever seen and ever met. That was my first impression. Now, after that, we started to work together to try to refine the protocol. And I remember that we did that at an AS meeting. And that was the first time and the last time I've seen you in a bad mood for several days. Do you remember why? Do you remember where it was? It was in Orlando. It was in Disneyland. And I think the understatement of the day is to say that you were not really comfortable with the surroundings there. You were extremely upset about the pink-colored columns of the plastic world that was the venue we were having the conference in. But that was the only time I've seen you in a bad mood. And you were still productive, and I think we still advanced the project and the protocol at that time. And you also mentioned that about that time I was asked and appointed as chair of this Europe project committee. This was definitely not for my scientific excellence. There was excellence in the group. It was for the hope that I would bring in diplomatic skills as a good Scandinavian into the project. Because at that time I don't think the project needed any more scientific excellence, but there was some need for diplomacy, and I tried to do that. The work that has been going on and the collaboration for the next 16 years has been really extremely pleasant. Fantastic collaboration, But of course, with every relation that lasts for 16 years, there is some friction, and there are a few conflicts. And whenever I failed in the diplomatic tasks that I was given, you stepped in. You stepped in, and you have a fantastic way of managing conflicts and tension. And with that, you contributed very much to the project. You saved the project on many occasions. And I think I would say that my first impression was not the right one. You were not a typical Brit, or you were a typical super Swede. When it comes to diplomatic skills. And I think it's not by chance that you were given the Royal Order of the Polar Star of Sweden, which cannot be given to a Swedish citizen. Did you know that? It cannot be given to a Swedish citizen, but it can only be given to an international citizen that is a super Swede. So thank you very much for the wonderful collaboration. I look forward to the next 16 years. Thank you.
Sam said he was daunted standing up here, and after that speech from Frank, it's very difficult to speak after that. But Sam also spoke about friendships and supports and stuff, and I think everybody in the room has felt a lot of that from Frank. And today we heard a lot about the three musketeers, that being Sam, Mark and Terry. But just as in the 1970s Charlie had his angels, Frank's got a couple of angels as well. So Janet, Alison and myself.
Three angels.
Sorry?
3 angels.
3 angels, yep. So we've worked as coordinators on the pregnancy register at various times. Janet's still spearheading the whole thing and carrying a massive load. So thanks to all women, to Janet for that. And as Terry has said, we've worked at the Coldface with Frank for a lot of years, and we've all heard about how professional Frank is and how he works really hard, and we just wanted to share a couple of little anecdotes from our personal experience. Frank's work rate is just ferocious. Like, he puts out so much work, and so you have the energy of a 2-year-old, and take it from me, it's just amazing. I don't know how you do it. None of us can keep up with you. We always have several of us tag teaming, and Frank would come in on Wednesday mornings and he would say something like, "Oh, I've spoken to Mervyn," and we all went, "Oh my God, this means so much work for us." Or he says, "Oh, I've had an idea for a paper," and then Frank would bring out a piece of paper that had so much blue ink on it that you couldn't see any white on it any longer, and from that he would just have this eloquent, amazing paper written, perfectly formulated, and he, smacked it on the tram or something like that coming in. And then we would sit down and we would be writing it all out, sort of longhand or typing it out or something like that. And I remember on several occasions, but this one rings in my mind, I said to Frank, "There aren't any references. We'll need some references for this. Get a pen." So I got a pen, and he's, "Okay, that line, it comes from this paper, it was this journal, it was this year, but not the 1996 one, it was his 1997 paper, and it was something like this, and with these authors." And he would go through sort of every paragraph and just inserting all of these references just from no papers, just all from the top of his head. And we're writing furiously, and then we've got to look up all these, and at the end he'd sort of go, "Is that about 30? How many do you need? Do you need 35? I'll come through in a few minutes." And he would just pepper just these things through. They were like confetti. He could just throw them out, and it was we thought he was making it up, but really he just wasn't, and it was just amazing. But before he would come in with this enormous amount of work for us, he would always take the time to ask each and every one of us how we were and how our families were, how our children are, and he was always very supportive. And Frank is generous to a fault. I think everybody in the room realises you just to a fault. And Patrick Kwan today said something about, a crack about lowering the age of the overall, speakers by 40 years or something like that. Well, I think I'm about 2 generations away from Frank, and Frank's old school. He does everything old-fashioned, and it's so wonderful, from, you know, refusing to let anybody else buy him a coffee to, we've had several instances where I would open the door, because I was raised that you open a door for somebody older than you and you offer a chair for somebody older than you, and I would open the door and Frank would say, no, you first, and I would say, you first, and you first, and you first, and you first, and we would be standing there for like 10 minutes arguing, and eventually, like many others in the room, I realised you don't win an argument with Frank, so you just go through the door and you thank him very much for holding it for you. Sam also mentioned, all of the extra bonds and stuff that we have, and I too have mine with Frank and Sweden. And with this in mind, for your kindness, generosity, friendship and guidance, I say tack så mycket. Thank you.
Hey!